They say you can discern the very essence of a person's character by observing how they treat someone from whom they believe they can gain nothing. I have found this adage to be not merely true but devastatingly, unerringly true. And those individuals who invariably mistake a quiet demeanor for weakness, who interpret patience as ignorance, who glance across a well-appointed room at an unassuming old man in simple, clean clothes and perceive absolutely nothing worthy of respect, these are, without exception, the most fascinating subjects of human observation. My name is William Hayes, and I have intentionally embodied that quiet, unassuming old man for my entire life. I am 69 years old. My daily commute involves a 2003 Buick LeSabre, a venerable machine my daughter, Serena, has been imploring me to replace for the better part of 3 years now. It is silver, or perhaps, more accurately, it was times silver once. Now, its hue suggests more of a silver-adjacent situation, the kind of muted, experienced shade a car acquires after having thoroughly lived its life under countless suns and drenching rains, a vehicle that has long since ceased to care for anyone's aesthetic judgment. I dress in clean, unostentatious clothes, nothing that announces my presence when I enter a room, no flashy labels or attention-grabbing patterns. I reside in the same house on Elmwood Drive that I purchased 31 years ago. It's a quiet, tree-lined street where the ancient oak trees have witnessed more seasons than most of the neighborhood's marriages, and where residents still offer a friendly wave from their porches on Sunday mornings. My next-door neighbor, Bill Patterson, a retired postal worker, a genuinely good man but a truly terrible golfer, once leaned over our shared fence on a Saturday afternoon and, with a knowing chuckle, informed me I was the most unfancy rich guy he'd ever had the pleasure of meeting. I simply told him I wasn't rich. He laughed. I laughed in return. We then spent a comfortable 20 minutes discussing the progress of his tomato garden before I retreated inside. Here is what Bill Patterson doesn't know, what my Sunday morning church friends don't know, what the eager young salesman at the dealership, who once earnestly attempted to persuade me into something newer and more fitting, didn't know when I smiled politely and said, "The LeSabre is just fine, son." I am the founder and sole owner of Cornerstone Group, a sprawling enterprise encompassing real estate, private equity, a robust media subsidiary, and a labyrinthine network of holdings meticulously structured across 4 states and 3 countries. This empire is so carefully layered and interwoven that my name, William Hayes, appears nowhere obvious. There's no glowing Forbes profile, no charity gala banner emblazoned with my smiling face, no glossy feature in any business magazine boasting a headline about my meteoric journey to the top. I built it precisely this way, deliberately, brick by brick, crucial decision by crucial decision, over 4 relentless decades of rising before the sun and retiring long after midnight, never once making the rookie mistake of confusing mere visibility with intrinsic value. Cornerstone Group is conservatively valued at $3.1 billion. And yet, I continue to drive a car with a perpetually dented mirror and an air conditioner that operates on a whimsical schedule of its own choosing. And I would not alter a single solitary detail. Now, allow me to introduce you to my daughter. Serena Hayes Cross is 34 years old, and she is, without the slightest exaggeration, the single finest thing I have ever built or nurtured in this life. She is sharper than I am, possesses a warmth that surpassed even her late mother's, God rest her soul. She has this particular laugh, a melodic sound that begins as a quiet ripple before effortlessly commandeering an entire room, often before she even realizes it's happened. I recall a vivid memory from when she was just 7 years old. She once negotiated an additional 30 minutes of television time for me using a perfectly crafted 3-point argument to which I genuinely had no viable counter. I remember sitting there, utterly disarmed, thinking, this child is going to be truly dangerous one day. I was entirely correct in that assessment. What I failed to anticipate, however, was who times she would eventually marry. 3 years ago, Serena brought Aaron Cross into our lives. Now, I genuinely wish to be fair to Aaron. I strive to be measured and balanced, to grant the man his rightful due. So, Aaron Cross is the human equivalent of a firm handshake that, for reasons unfathomable, persists just a little too long. He is 38 years old, stands exactly 6 feet tall, and possesses that particular brand of good looks often cultivated by men who invest considerable time in front of mirrors. He favors impeccably tailored suits and watches that command prices exceeding the cost of some people's automobiles. And he has this incessant habit of subtly, yet relentlessly, steering every single conversation, without exception, back to something times he times has achieved, something times he times owns, or some impressive locale times he times has recently graced with his presence. Within the first 15 minutes of our initial meeting, he managed to weave in his MBA, his golf handicap, and the undeniable fact that he had recently attended a conference in Geneva. Geneva. He pronounced the word Geneva with that peculiar, almost theatrical emphasis, the way people articulate it when they are desperately seeking your acknowledgement that they have, indeed, been to Geneva. I simply nodded. "That's wonderful, son," I said, my voice betraying nothing. 6 months after first meeting Serena, Aaron Cross was appointed CEO of Crosspoint Logistics. Now, pay close attention, because here is where our story truly begins to thicken, and I need you to stay with me, as this detail is profoundly important. Crosspoint Logistics is a cornerstone subsidiary of the Cornerstone Group, a truly solid company. It boasts 412 dedicated employees, holds critical contracts with some of the largest distribution networks across the country, possesses good bones, and represents significant, tangible value. Aaron Cross secured that coveted position through what appeared, on the surface, to be a completely standard, highly competitive search process. There was a reputable recruitment firm involved, multiple rigorous rounds of interviews, extensive reference checks, and a thorough board evaluation. The entire process, from the external vantage point, appeared utterly immaculate. What absolutely nobody knew, what Aaron Cross specifically did not know, and, to this very day, remains blissfully unaware of, is that I quietly, meticulously controlled every single step of that process from its inception to its conclusion. I observed his interviews through a one-way audio-visual arrangement I had discreetly made with the recruitment firm. I personally reviewed every single one of his references, cross-referencing them against my own extensive network. I read every evaluation the board submitted, scrutinizing them for even the slightest nuance. I approved his comprehensive compensation package, and finally, I signed off on his official appointment. And then, I simply went home, changed into my familiar gardening clothes, and planted 3 new rose bushes along the back fence. Aaron Cross had become CEO of my company. That evening, he sent me a text message that simply read, "Big news. Just landed a huge CEO role. Serena is so proud. Hard work pays off," I replied, my thumbs moving with practiced ease. "Congratulations, son. Well deserved." Then I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and watched the evening news. The familiar hum of the television a stark contrast to the intricate machinations I had just concluded. I want to be absolutely honest with you about something. In the beginning, I genuinely wanted to afford Aaron Cross a fair chance. I truly did. I am not a man who forms immutable opinions about people in haste. I have hired and mentored enough human beings throughout my long lifetime to understand intrinsically that first impressions are precisely that, mere first impressions. People possess the capacity to grow. People have the potential to surprise you. And I have, on many occasions, been genuinely surprised before. Aaron Cross, however, did not surprise me. What he did, instead, was to reveal to me, slowly but with unwavering consistency, precisely who he was, layer by painful layer. It began subtly, as these things always do, with small, seemingly innocuous slights. Then came that evening at his company dinner times, his Times company. He firmly believed where he introduced me to his colleagues. One of them, a sharply dressed young VP type with an abundance of hair product, politely inquired about my profession. Before I could even part my lips to speak, Aaron interjected, and I quote him verbatim, "He's retired, Serena's dad." And then, turning back to his colleague, "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Hayes." And just like that, I was smoothly, almost imperceptibly, moved along, ushered aside like an errant guest who had inadvertently wandered into the wrong ballroom. I smiled. I moved along, filing the incident away into the vast, organized archives of my memory. But the moment, the singular, specific moment that fundamentally altered everything, transpired on a Tuesday afternoon approximately 4 months ago. I had made a discreet stop by Crosspoint's corporate offices to handle a sensitive matter through one of my holding company representatives. I was simply in the building, unremarkable as always, an old man in clean, modest clothes whom nobody glanced at twice. And as I passed the hushed corridor leading to the executive floor, I distinctly heard Aaron's voice emanating from just around the corner. He was conversing with someone, another executive by the sound of their low, resonant tones. I instinctively stopped. Serena's dad, Aaron was saying, and I could vividly discern the self-satisfied smirk in his voice. Oh, he's harmless. Poor old guy. Peaked early, I think. You know the type. Was probably somebody back in the day. Now he just potters around his garden and drives that old Buick. He then lowered his voice, but not quite enough for his words to be entirely lost. Serena feels responsible for him, which is, a lot sometimes, but what can you do? Family is family. I felt a quiet fury ignite within me, but I betrayed nothing. I calmly straightened my jacket, adjusted the cuffs, and walked quietly back the way I had come, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Peaked early. Drives that old Buick. I allowed those corrosive words to marinate within me, to fester, for 4 long, deliberative months. I am a patient man. It is a trait inherited from a long, proud lineage of patient men. My father, a man of profound wisdom and stoicism, used to often say, "William, the river does not fight the rock. It merely keeps moving." And eventually, the rock is gone. I kept moving. If you've been listening for a while, please do us one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you absolutely nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. The dinner invitation arrived unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. Serena called me, her voice brimming with her characteristic excitement and warmth. Aaron's parents, Gerald and Margaret Cross, were hosting a family dinner at their sprawling estate out in Westfield. Gerald was a distinguished retired investment banker, a man whose reputation preceded him. Margaret was precisely the kind of woman whose entire personality appeared to be meticulously constructed around the impressive square footage of her meticulously maintained home. They expressed a desire for all of us to gather, to become one large, blissfully happy family. "Dad, you'll absolutely love them," Serena chirped, her tone utterly convinced. "They're such warm, welcoming people." "I'm sure they are, sweetheart," I said, my voice gentle and reassuring. I already possessed certain inconvenient truths about Gerald and Margaret Cross that would have rendered that sentence exceedingly difficult for Serena to complete had she known, but I held my tongue. I simply told her I would be there. I told her I was genuinely looking forward to it. Then, Aaron called. He called me directly, which in itself was unusual enough to pique my interest. He was overly friendly, excessively casual. In that specific way people adopt when they are on the verge of uttering something they instinctively know is slightly offensive, yet have firmly resolved to say it anyway. "Hey, so, just a heads up about Saturday," he began, his voice laced with forced nonchalance. "Gerald and Margaret, they're pretty, traditional, old school. So, it might be worth maybe, I don't know, dressing up a little. Nothing crazy, just, something a bit sharper than usual." There was a pregnant pause. A silent expectation hanging in the air. "Aaron," I said pleasantly, my tone even, "I appreciate you thinking of me." Of course," he quickly interjected, audibly relieved. "Just want everyone to be comfortable. You know how it is." "I do," I said, my voice holding a hidden meaning he completely missed. "I'll see you Saturday." I hung up the phone. I gazed at my reflection in the hallway mirror for a long, contemplative moment. Then I walked to my closet, moved deliberately past the suits hanging in the very back, the charcoal ones, the navy ones, the ones I wore 11 years ago when Cornerstone closed its single largest acquisition. I moved past all of it, and from the very front, I pulled out my simplest clothes, meticulously clean, perfectly pressed, utterly modest. I carefully laid them out for Saturday. Then I walked out to the driveway, where the old Buick LeSabre waited. I gently patted its roof twice, the way you might pat the shoulder of a trusted confidant before embarking on something immensely important. "We're going to a dinner, old girl," I mused, a quiet smile playing on my lips. "The dress code is humble. We've got that perfectly covered. Because here is what Aaron Cross fundamentally did not understand. Here is what Gerald and Margaret Cross, in their well-manicured world, did not grasp. Here is what absolutely nobody in that opulent dining room was going to comprehend, until it was far, far too late. I wasn't dressing down because I possessed nothing better to wear. I was dressing down with a precise, strategic intention. I wanted to observe with absolute clarity exactly who they truly were when they mistakenly believed nothing significant was at stake. And I possessed a feeling, a very quiet yet utterly certain, 4 decades in the making kind of feeling, that they were about to reveal everything. Saturday was coming, and so was I. Saturday arrived in the manner all truly important days invariably do, quietly without fanfare, almost as if it were oblivious to the profound significance it was about to assume. I woke at precisely 5:30 inches the morning, as I have every single day for the past 40 years, following a ritualistic discipline. I made my coffee, black, no sugar, prepared in precisely the same way my father had consumed it, and his father before him. I settled into my accustomed seat at the kitchen table, positioned by the window, overlooking the garden, and watched the dawn break, slow and gray, painting the ancient oak tree in the backyard with a subtle, evolving light. I was calm. I am always calm. It is, perhaps, the most consistently underestimated weapon a man can possess. I dressed slowly, deliberately, selecting each item with careful consideration. Clean, well-creased slacks, a simple button-down shirt in a light, unassuming blue, pressed perfectly the night before. My everyday shoes, meticulously polished but utterly unremarkable. No watch worth even a passing mention. I surveyed my reflection in the hallway mirror for a moment. A critical self-assessment. Yes, I thought. A quiet affirmation. That's exactly right. I walked out to the driveway. The LeSabre sat there in the nascent morning light, its faded silver shimmering, its posture unhurried, the cracked passenger mirror catching a thin, almost poetic sliver of the early sun. I climbed inside. The engine turned over with its familiar morning groan, that low, rattling complaint that, over the years, I have come to find oddly comforting, before settling into its steady, rhythmic idle. Let's go see who these people truly are, I mused, a silent resolve hardening within me, and I set off on the drive to Westfield. The Cross estate loomed at the end of a long, meticulously maintained private driveway, bordered by precisely trimmed hedges. These hedges were groomed with a kind of aggressive perfection that unmistakably communicated a very specific message to any arriving guest. We are people who control things, even the hedges. I guided the LeSabre through the imposing wrought iron gate and followed the winding driveway to the grand facade of the house. A young man was stationed near the entrance, a figure neither quite a valet nor quite a butler, but rather an ambiguous presence whose entire job appeared to be to make arriving guests feel either effusively welcomed or subtly assessed, depending entirely upon what they drove. He looked at the LeSabre, then he looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my modest attire. Then he looked back at the LeSabre, with an expression I have witnessed countless times in my life. The unmistakable expression of a young man performing a rapid, unspoken, and decidedly unfavorable calculation. "Good evening, sir," he said, recovering professionally, a practiced smile pasted on his face. "I can take your car around for you." "Thank you, son," I said, extending the keys, their weight familiar in my palm. "She pulls a little to the left. Don't let that alarm you." He nodded, his expression a concentrated mask of a man striving valiantly not to harbor any further visceral feelings about the somewhat dilapidated vehicle he had just been entrusted with. I straightened my shirt, a small, habitual gesture, and walked toward the imposing front door. Gerald Cross, a tall, commanding figure of 72 with distinguished silver hair and broad shoulders, opened it before I even had a chance to knock. He possessed the kind of innate physical presence that had likely effortlessly dominated rooms for the greater part of his life. He was dressed in that particular style favored by wealthy men at home, expensive casual wear, clothes that often cost more than formal attire, but were meticulously designed to appear utterly relaxed and understated. His smile, when he finally saw me, was warm, meticulously practiced, the kind of smile that is carefully assembled for public consumption rather than genuinely felt. "William," he boomed, extending his hand in a firm, confident gesture. "So glad you could make it. Come in, come in." His handshake lasted for precisely as long as it needed to, not one fraction of a second more. I noticed. The house itself was everything the meticulously manicured driveway had so grandly promised: soaring high ceilings, vast expanses of walls adorned with art, chosen more for its impressive provenance than for any genuine aesthetic love, a grand staircase that curved gracefully upward with the quiet confidence of a structural masterpiece that was acutely aware of being admired. Every polished surface, every carefully curated object, communicated the same unspoken message with absolute clarity. Asterisk. We have always possessed this. We were born into this. This is simply the unchanging landscape of our lives. Asterisk. Margaret Cross then emerged from the direction of what I assumed was the sitting room, her entrance as composed as a staged performance. She was elegant in that particular way. Certain women of a specific generation and tax bracket are elegant, perfectly assembled, meticulously precise, not a single detail unconsidered. Her jewelry was understated in the specific way that very expensive jewelry is often understated, which is to say, it was not understated at all. "William," she cooed warmly, taking both my hands in hers, a gesture people often employ when they wish physical contact to serve as a superficial substitute for actual sincerity. "We have heard so much about you. You are just as sweet as Serena described." Sweet. There it was, the very first word out of her perfectly glossed mouth. Asterisk. Sweet asterisk. Not impressive, not accomplished, not interesting, just asterisk. Sweet asterisk. The kind of benign, slightly condescending descriptor people reserve for golden retrievers and amiable elderly relatives who no longer quite follow the thread of conversation. "Thank you, Margaret," I replied warmly, my own smile equally pleasant and entirely unrevealing. "You have a beautiful home," she beamed, a flicker of genuine pleasure crossing her carefully composed features. People who have meticulously built their entire identity around their possessions never seem to tire of hearing those possessions complimented. Serena then appeared from across the expansive room and immediately crossed the distance to me, wrapping her arms around me in that familiar, comforting embrace she had given me since she was just 4 years old. I held on to that hug for just a moment longer than usual, savoring the genuine warmth. "You look great, Dad," she whispered, her voice soft against my ear. "So do you, sweetheart," I murmured in return. Aaron then materialized smoothly behind her, his presence a slight disturbance in the air. He glanced at my modest outfit, and I caught the almost imperceptible flicker of an expression he controlled with impressive speed, a mere half-second, a brief, pained look that clearly conveyed, asterisk, I specifically asked him to dress up, asterisk, followed instantaneously by his practiced recovery smile. "William, glad you made it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder with a performative warmth that was clearly intended for an unseen audience. "Come on in. Gerald just opened something special." Asterisk. Something special, asterisk. I would come to understand that this was the pervasive theme of the entire evening. Everything, from the vintage wine to the gourmet food, from the architectural grandeur of the house itself to the perceived familial bond, was touted as something special. Everything, it seemed, except for me. We then transitioned into the elegant dining room. The table was set with a kind of deliberate, almost intimidating formality that clearly took hours to arrange, and was specifically designed to make certain guests, like myself, feel acutely the vast, unspoken gap between themselves and their hosts. Crystal glasses glittered under the soft light, heavy silverware gleamed, and tall, elegant candles, which had probably never been lit before tonight, and would likely never be lit again, stood poised. I took my designated seat. I unfolded my linen napkin with meticulous care. I looked around the table at these people who had so graciously invited me into their home, and in that very moment, I chose to become invisible. Not because anyone at that table actually made me invisible, but because I consciously chose it. I have spent 69 years accumulating the wisdom that the single most dangerous thing a man can do in a room full of people who profoundly underestimate him is to correct that underestimation too soon. So, I sat. I smiled politely. I asked innocuous, pleasant questions. I offered a compliment to the wine, which I had not yet even tasted, but which Gerald had already extolled at length. And I watched. Gerald, as expected, led the conversation in the way men like Gerald invariably lead conversations. From the very front, loudly, with the absolute, unshakable confidence of someone who has never once in his life been told he was talking too much. He expounded at length about the volatile markets, about a recent, rather exclusive trip to the Highlands of Scotland, and of course, about Aaron's extraordinary, almost prophetic instincts at Crosspoint. "The boy has completely transformed that company," Gerald declared, swirling his glass of red wine with an air of profound satisfaction. "The board respects him enormously. I always knew he had it in him. Leadership is in the blood, I believe." He cast a quick, meaningful glance in my direction, just informatively. In that particular way people look at you when they wish to establish a stark contrast without having to articulate it directly. I merely nodded appreciatively. "That's wonderful," I said, my voice smooth and non-committal. "You must be very proud." Then he turned his attention to Serena, a smile forming on his lips that had a very specific, almost pointed shape. "And Serena, my dear, You must feel so secure having a husband who provides so well. It's such a blessing. Not every girl is so lucky. The table went subtly, momentarily quiet, for just a fraction of a second, the unspoken implications hanging heavy in the air. Serena managed a gracious smile, but I saw her eyes. I saw the fleeting shadow of discomfort there. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and said absolutely nothing, because the Times envelope times hadn't arrived yet, and I knew, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who has been patiently waiting for 40 years, that when it finally did, everything at this table was going to change, irrevocably. I just had to wait a little longer. There is a specific moment in every long, protracted game when patience ceases to be a mere virtue and, instead, transforms into an irrefutable verdict. That moment arrived with dessert. I had been seated at that table for 2 long, deliberative hours. 2 hours of nodding, 2 hours of smiling, 2 hours of asking polite questions to which I already knew the answers, 2 hours of complimenting wine I didn't particularly care for, and laughing at Gerald Cross's self-congratulatory stories that were never quite as amusing as Gerald Cross evidently believed them to be. I had played my assigned role flawlessly. The sweet old man, Serena's retired dad, the kindly fellow with the funny old car who supposedly peaked early and now harmlessly potters around his garden on Sunday mornings. I wore that carefully crafted role, like a perfectly comfortable, unassuming jacket, all evening, and not a single person at that table suspected, for one solitary second, that underneath it resided something else entirely. Then Gerald reached deliberately beneath his chair, and in that precise instant I felt it. That quiet, internal shift that I have learned to recognize over 4 decades of strategic observation. The shift that occurs when a situation moves decisively from a mere prologue to the actual story, when the crucial thing you have been patiently waiting for finally, irrevocably arrives. He placed a thick, leather-bound document onto the pristine white tablecloth, smoothed it once with the flat of his palm, and then, with an air of practiced solemnity, slid it across the polished surface directly to me. "William," Gerald began, his voice dropping into the carefully measured, almost rehearsed register of a man who has clearly envisioned and practiced this very moment countless times. "There's something we'd like to discuss as a family." I looked at the document lying there, a seemingly innocuous object laden with unspoken intent. I did not touch it yet. Margaret's hands were folded primly on the table, her gaze fixed. Aaron had straightened perceptibly in his chair, adopting the rigid posture of a man attempting, with minimal success, to appear utterly casual about something he was, in fact, far from casual about. Serena glanced quickly at me, her expression a fleeting mix of uncertainty and apprehension, and then looked back at her father-in-law, her shoulders slightly tensed. I looked at her hands clasped in her lap. They were not still. "Aaron has a vision," Gerald continued, his voice gaining momentum, a note of almost paternal pride. "A real vision, an independent venture, his own company built meticulously from the ground up. The kind of singular opportunity that only presents itself once in a man's life. We believe in him completely, implicitly." "As you should," I interjected warmly, my voice entirely agreeable. "What we need is startup capital," Gerald stated, cutting to the chase, his gaze sweeping the table. "And what we're proposing," he nodded meaningfully toward the document, its leather binding gleaming, "is a relatively straightforward arrangement. Serena's inheritance, used as collateral to secure the initial funding. Fully legal, properly drawn up, above board in every conceivable way." He paused, leaning forward slightly, his eyes holding mine with a calculated intensity. "We just need your blessing, William, as Serena's father." He then looked pointedly at Margaret, whose smile had acquired the fixed, almost brittle quality of something applied, rather than genuinely felt. Then at Aaron, whose face was a mask of calm certainty, a man already mentally allocating and spending money he had unequivocally decided was his by right. And I thought, asterisk, you have absolutely no idea who you just handed that envelope to. Asterisk. I reached out, picked up the document, and opened it. I read every single page slowly and deliberately, my eyes meticulously tracing every line of text, every carefully worded paragraph, every legal clause, while the candles flickered, casting dancing shadows, and the ornate clock on the wall marked every agonizing second. Nobody at that table dared utter a single word. I read every carefully worded paragraph, every snorts number. Then with an air of unhurried finality, I closed it, set it gently back down on the table, picked up my water glass, and took a slow, unhurried sip. Then, and only then, did I look directly at Gerald Cross, offering him the warmest, most reassuring smile I possessed. "I appreciate the tremendous thought that went into this," I said pleasantly, my voice smooth as silk. "I'll review it carefully." Gerald visibly exhaled, like a man who had been holding his breath, trapped underwater, for an impossibly long hour. Aaron's shoulders sagged imperceptibly, dropping a half-inch from their rigid posture. Margaret reached for her wine glass with the relieved, almost celebratory energy of a woman who genuinely believes the hard part, the uncomfortable part, is finally over. They thought they had won. I calmly finished my water, engaged in pleasant, desultory conversation for another 20 minutes, thanked Margaret profusely for what I termed a wonderful evening, and then shook Gerald's hand. This time, it was a full, firm handshake, my eyes holding his for just 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. He didn't know, not yet, what that extra second truly meant. I walked out to the driveway. The young valet, who had spent the entire evening quietly judging my car, brought the LeSabre around, his expression now one of a man who had finally made his peace with its humble presence. I tipped him generously, far more than he expected, and watched his guarded expression slowly transform into one of genuine surprise and gratitude. I slid into the driver's seat. The ancient engine, a faithful companion for so long, groaned in protest as I turned the key, a familiar, weary cough. I half-heartedly toggled the air conditioning switch. It considered my request for a moment, a faint whirring sound, then politely declined, settling back into its customary silence. The summer heat was a given, an old acquaintance. I backed the LeSabre out of the manicured driveway, leaving behind the silent, knowing judgment of the valet, and drove into the shroud of the dark, quiet streets. A profound calm had settled over me, a stillness so deep it might have unnerved anyone who truly understood the seismic shift that was about to occur. For 14 days I maintained that unwavering facade. Not a single word, not an impulsive reaction, not even the slightest visible ripple disturbed the placid surface of my life. I became a master of the mundane, moving through my days with deliberate, almost ritualistic normalcy. Sunday mornings were spent amongst my roses, their petals soft against my fingertips, their silent growth a stark contrast to the brewing storm. On Wednesday afternoons, I'd meet Dill Patterson for coffee, exchanging pleasantries about local politics and the weather, listening to his harmless gossip, my own thoughts tucked away like hidden cards. I went to church, sang hymns, and drove the LeSabre to the grocery store and back, the clinking of bottles in the trunk the loudest sound in my world. On the fourth day, as predicted, Aaron's text arrived, a digital echo of his breezy confidence. "Hey, William, just checking in. Hope you had a chance to look at the proposal. Exciting stuff, right?" I let it sit for exactly 3 hours, the glowing screen a tiny, impatient beacon on my kitchen counter. Then, I picked up my phone, my fingers slow and deliberate, and typed my reply. "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." A thumbs-up emoji was his immediate, unthinking response, a digital shrug of assumed understanding. I set the phone back down. The charade was almost over. My next action was immediate, precise. I made a phone call, not to Aaron, of course, nor to Gerald. This call was reserved for 3 very specific individuals, men whose names commanded respect across the city, the senior members of the Crosspoint Logistics Board of Directors. Men who had known me for decades, men who understood instinctively that when my number appeared on their private line, it was never a social occasion. There was no pleasantry, no preamble. "Run the audit," I said, my voice quiet, almost a whisper, yet imbued with an unmistakable authority that required no shouting. "Standard cycle, full scope, begin immediately." The words hung in the air. A quiet command dropped into the vast machinery of corporate oversight. Then I hung up, the click echoing in the sudden silence of my study, and returned to my garden, the scent of damp earth, a comforting anchor. For I possessed a piece of knowledge that Aaron Cross, in his youthful arrogance, utterly lacked. A truth also unknown to Gerald and Margaret Cross, who, I imagined, were at that very moment ensconced in their sprawling Westfield estate, toasting their imagined triumph with expensive, oblivious wine. I had personally drafted Aaron's employment contract, every painstaking clause, every precise line, deep within its pages, intentionally tucked away like a venomous spider in a silken web, lay a non-compete and fiduciary duty clause, a clause Aaron had signed 3 years prior. his eyes undoubtedly glazing over the dense legalese, his pen moving carelessly, without bothering to read carefully enough. This wasn't some recent amendment. This was a clause I had authored 15 years before Aaron Cross, a Callow graduate, ever walked into my life, a full decade and a half before he was even a blip on my radar. It was a clause meticulously crafted, a legal safeguard designed with chilling precision for exactly this kind of man, those who possess an unshakable, self-serving belief that they are inherently smarter than everyone else in the room. I had been patient for 15 years. Waiting 14 more days was a triviality. The audit, exhaustive and meticulous, took 11 days to fully document its findings. When the final thick report landed on my mahogany desk, its weight was palpable, a testament to months of concealed malfeasance. I sat with it for a long time, the afternoon light fading around me. Not because I was surprised. I was anything but surprised. Every line confirmed what I had known intuitively, what I had predicted with chilling accuracy. I sat with it because I needed to be absolutely, utterly, irrevocably certain. Certain before I unleashed what came next. The report detailed, in excruciating detail, how Aaron Cross had spent the last 8 months, systematically and methodically, constructing his independent venture. He had done it on company time, using company devices, leveraging Crosspoint's invaluable internal contacts and client relationships to build a rival business that would directly compete with Cornerstone Holdings. He had acted with quiet diligence, shrouded in secrecy, convinced with an almost comical self-assurance that no one above him, certainly not the quiet old man who had given him his start, was watching. He had, in his hubris, forgotten a fundamental truth I consider paramount. You cannot build a secret empire within the very walls of the house that belongs to the man you are trying to hide it from. Every clandestine meeting, every illicit document, every compromised contact made on company time, all of it constituted a direct and undeniable violation of the very clause he had signed. All of it was now documented, meticulously compiled, sitting in a single, incriminating folder on my desk. It was a Thursday morning. I reached into the back of my closet and pulled out the charcoal suit, pressed the night before, its fabric cool and crisp against my fingers. I drove the LeSabre to Crosspoint Logistics, the engine humming a surprisingly smooth tune. I pulled into the reserved space directly out front, the one marked with a discreet placard, Cornerstone Group, Reserved. It was the same space Aaron Cross had driven past 3 times a week for 3 years, never once bothering to ask whose name belonged to it, never once questioning the invisible hand that held the reins. I walked into that gleaming conference room. Board members, their faces grave and expectant, were already seated to my left. Our legal team, sharp-suited and impassive, occupied the chairs to my right. The incriminating folder lay open on the polished surface before me. In approximately 4 minutes, Aaron Cross would walk through that door, believing he was merely arriving for a routine check-in, a casual conversation with the senior team. I straightened my jacket, the gesture slow and deliberate, a final tightening of the noose. I waited. The door opened. Aaron strode in, his usual confidence draped around him like a perfectly tailored coat, easy, natural, fitting perfectly to his broad shoulders. His eyes, bright and expectant, swept across the room, taking in the board members, the lawyers, the documents spread on the table. Then, his gaze snagged on me, sitting at the head of what he considered Times His Times table, in Times His Times conference room, wearing a suit he had never once seen me wear. I watched it happen in real time, the dawning comprehension, the understanding moving across his face in slow motion, floor by agonizing floor, as if a spotlight was illuminating a series of damning revelations. The distant memory of the recruitment search, the intricate details of the contract, the chilling findings of the audit, Gerald's proud, oblivious smile at dinner, the envelope sliding across the table that night. Every single moment of the last 3 years converged, crashing down on him all at once in that pristine conference room on a Thursday morning. The silence, heavy and suffocating, stretched for a full 10 seconds. I let every one of those realizations land, each one a hammer blow to his carefully constructed reality. Then, my voice quiet, almost gentle, I finally spoke. "Sit down, Aaron." He sat. The confident posture evaporated, replaced by a rigid, almost childlike stillness. "I'm going to say this once," I continued, my gaze steady, unwavering. "Not because I'm angry. I want you to understand that, Aaron. I am not angry. Anger," I explained, "is for men who didn't see this coming. I saw this coming, Aaron, from the very moment you slid that car printout across my kitchen counter 3 years ago. I opened the folder, its contents a testament to his betrayal. Crosspoint Logistics, I stated. The facts stark and unyielding, is owned by Cornerstone Group. Cornerstone Group is owned by me, has been for 19 years. The company you run, the substantial salary you earn, the reputation you have meticulously spent 3 years building your entire identity around, all of it exists because I times built it. I appointed you because I genuinely believed in what I saw, in your potential. I gave you every resource you needed to become something real, something significant. And for 8 months, Aaron, you systematically used those very resources to construct something designed to compete against the very foundation that made you. I closed the folder with a soft, final click. The clause in your contract, Aaron, the one you signed without reading carefully enough, covers every single thing the audit found. Our legal team, as you can see, is fully prepared to pursue this to its full conclusion, if necessary. Every last trace of the swaggering confidence he had walked in with was utterly gone. He looked, suddenly and profoundly, for the first time since I had known him, very young, very small, and very, very far from the sophisticated corporate circles of Geneva he so admired. However, I continued, my voice softening just a fraction. I am not interested in destroying you, Aaron. That is not my objective. I am interested in clarity. So, here is what happens next. You resign today, quietly, professionally. Your reputation remains intact, and this entire matter stays discreetly between these walls. Or, we proceed legally, and everything in this folder, every damning detail, becomes part of a very public, very damaging record. He looked at the board members, their faces impassive, neutral. He looked at the legal team, their expressions equally unreadable. Then his gaze flickered back to me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. And I will admit, honestly, it moved me, if only slightly. Not anger, not defiant bravado, not the desperate performance of a man trying to salvage a shattered situation. What I saw was shame. Real, profound shame. The deep, quiet kind that only surfaces when a man finally sees himself with complete, unflinching clarity and recognizes, with a crushing certainty, that he does not like what he finds. I'll resign, he said, his voice barely a whisper, the words seeming to cost him something immeasurable. Good, I replied. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and picked up my folder, its contents now silent, their power spent. At the door, I paused, turning back. One more thing, Aaron, I said. The proposal your father presented at dinner that night, Serena's inheritance as collateral for his venture. I let that sit in my mind for exactly 1 second. This morning, my lawyers completed the transfer of her inheritance directly into her name, irrevocably. It's now in a personal account that requires her signature alone, untouchable by anyone else. Gerald's proposal, therefore, is now a document concerning money that no longer exists where he believed it did. A pause. Tell your parents I said thank you for dinner. The lamb was excellent. I drove home in the LeSabre. This time, the engine cleared its throat with a surprisingly robust growl at the first turn of the key, as if relieved of a long-held burden. The air conditioning flickered on briefly, a hesitant whisper of cool air, before reconsidering its effort and settling back into silence. The cracked passenger mirror, a small imperfection I had never bothered to fix, caught the last golden rays of the afternoon light as I turned onto Elmwood Drive and pulled into my driveway. I sat in the car for a moment, just sat, letting the quiet solitude wash over me. 31 years. 31 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, the quiet observer, the one who blended into the background, all while knowing precisely who I was, every single moment of that time. I patted the dashboard once, a soft, affectionate tap. Good girl, I thought. A quiet acknowledgement of our shared journey. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She arrived 20 minutes later, finding me at the old, worn wooden kitchen table, 2 cups of steaming tea already poured, a silent invitation. She sat down across from me and looked at my face for a long, careful moment. The way she has looked at my face since she was 4 years old, reading it like a familiar map, a landscape she has known her entire life. And then, quietly, gently, from the very beginning, I laid out every piece of it, the company, the intricate structure, Aaron's initial appointment to Crosspoint, the contract clause I had so presciently written 15 years ago, the exhaustive audit, the cold tableau of the boardroom, the unexpected transfer of her inheritance. every single piece laid bare. When I finished, Serena remained silent for a long, reflective time, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her tea. Then, slowly, she looked up at me and asked the question, the only question that truly mattered, the one I had been carrying the answer to for 30 years. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about any of it? I looked down at my cup, the ceramic warm in my hands. My gaze drifted out to the dark garden, then back to my daughter. I saw her mother's eyes in her face, the same eyes that held a fierce intelligence and a boundless capacity for love. I saw the laugh that, even as a child, could take over entire rooms, filling them with pure joy. I saw the 7-year-old who had once out-argued me over television time and, to my everlasting amusement, won. Because I wanted you to choose your life, Serena, I said, the words coming from a deep, long-held conviction. Not to have it chosen for you by what I own, by the weight of my legacy. I never wanted you to look at me and simply see a company, a corporation. I wanted you to see your father. She cried. Deep, cleansing sobs that shook her shoulders. I reached across the table and held her hand, gently, firmly, and I simply let her. And as I held her hand, my mind drifted, momentarily, to Gerald Cross, sitting very still, I imagined, in his opulent estate in Westfield. To Margaret, perhaps setting down her glass of expensive wine, a dawning horror slowly replacing her celebratory flush. To Aaron, trying, desperately, to find the words to explain to his parents why the quiet old man in the simple clothes, the one they had so blithely dismissed, had turned out to be the single person in that dining room. Not for one solitary second they should ever have underestimated. I thought about all of that, the intricate dance of power, and pride, and consequence, and then I let it all go. Because the only thing in the world that truly mattered to me, the only thing that held any real weight, was sitting right across this table. My daughter, her hands wrapped around a warm cup, her eyes red from tears, yet smiling through them. My daughter, the finest thing I ever built. Some men don't look powerful. They just times or asterisk. And the ones who underestimate them, they always, always find out. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. I'll see you in the next one.